Now for today's program. Dr. Sophia Moskalenko is a social psychologist studying mass identity, intergroup conflict, and the appeal of conspiracy theories. Her research is focused on the psychology of radicalization and martyrdom. Dr. Moskalenko's work has been presented in scientific conferences, government briefings, radio broadcasts, and international television newscasts. As a research fellow at the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, she has worked on projects commissioned by the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, Department of Homeland Security, and Department of State. She has published several books, including the award-winning Friction: How Conflict Radicalizes Them and Us, and The Marvel of Martyrdom: The Power of Self-Sacrifice in a Selfish World. Dr. Moskalenko is currently a Minerva Research Initiative awardee with the Office of Naval Research and co-author of Pastels and Pedophiles with Mia Bloom. Dr. Mia Bloom is the International Security Fellow at the New America Foundation, a professor at Georgia State University, and a member of the Evidence-Based Cybersecurity at the Andrew Young School of Policy Studies. She has conducted research in Europe, the Middle East, and South Asia, and speaks 8 languages. She authored several books and articles on violent extremism, including Dying to Kill: The Allure of Suicide Terror, and Small Arms, Children in Terror, as well as Pastels and Pedophiles, Inside the Mind of QAnon, with Dr. Sophia Moskalenko. Dr. Bloom is publishing Veiled Threats: Women and Jihad in 2022. Dr. Bloom is a former term member of the Council on Foreign Relations and has held appointments at Princeton, Cornell, Harvard, and McGill universities. She serves on the Anti-Radicalization Board of the Anti-Defamation League and the UN Counterterrorism Executive Directorate, and a member of Women's Action and Leadership Network. Joining Sophia and Mia today is journalist Sarah Posner. Sarah is the author of UNHOLY: How White Christian Nationalists Powered the Trump Presidency and the Devastating Legacy They Left Behind. She is also a reporting fellow with Type Investigations. Her investigative reporting has appeared in Rolling Stone, Vice, Reveal, Vox, The Nation, Mother Jones, The New Republic, HuffPost, and Talking Points Memo. Her coverage and analysis of politics and religion has appeared in the New York Times, The Washington Post, The American Prospect, Politico, and many other outlets. Please welcome Sophia Moskalenko, Mia Bloom, and Sarah Posner.
Thanks, Suzanne, and thanks to Moment for hosting this really important conversation about this really excellent book on something that's really hard to write about. It's really hard to try to explain conspiracy theories because it's hard to explain something that often doesn't make very much sense. But you two have done an amazing job of lucidly tackling this very vexing topic. And so I wanted to just start out for the audience to just kind of lay the groundwork with Mia, and maybe you can just tell us very briefly, what is QAnon?
QAnon is this baseless conspiracy theory that began on the internet. And so it came after Pizzagate, but it encompasses things like Pizzagate, in which there is an allegation that there is a cabal of blood-drinking sexual predators that are mostly Democrats, but also some prominent Republicans that have been running the world since time began, and that they have been almost like the puppet masters controlling things. And according to QAnon, it basically, Donald Trump was the only person who could come and combat this cabal and break their control of things and save the children. And so we started from the premise that QAnon was this movement that we were seeing that people were likening to violent extremism. And so we started, both Sophia and I are experts on violent extremism. And what we saw actually was quite different. We saw some similarities, but we also saw some really important differences. And so we got together, we pooled our resources. Sophia is the best person in the world, does the psychology of terrorism. And so we thought, how do we explain QAnon? How do we explain why people find it so alluring? And what we came up with was the book. And basically, you know, sort of to bottom line up front, give you the bluff. People like conspiracy theories during periods of time when they're feeling anxious because it explains a world that is very confusing. And so if you are crossing the street and you get hit by a bus, it's so random. This is, you know, it doesn't make sense. But if you think the bus driver was aiming for you, so even though there's an evil plan, at least there was a plan. And I think that that's why we saw such an uptick in belief in QAnon conspiracy as soon as we saw the lockdowns for the pandemic. Because what QAnon did, and it was almost like this, like a conspiracy black hole that sucked in every other kind of conspiracy. It allowed people previously who would never have communicated, that believed that 9/11 was an inside job, the moon landing was fake. All of these different conspiracies came together under the umbrella of QAnon.
So let's talk very briefly, and we'll go into it in more detail, I think, as we continue this discussion. But speaking of conspiracy theories that have been around for a long time, how does QAnon tap into or build on or use ancient conspiracy theory, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories like the blood libel, or more recent anti-Semitic conspiracy theories like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion?
So this was actually a funny story. So one of my closest friends, so I went to yeshiva for school, and one of my friends is still from, and when she read the book very quickly, like she was one of the first people that bought the book, and she said, I recognize the lecture from Mar Tzuk's class from high school, in part because I had studied about anti-Semitism. I recognized it right away. And I think it's one of those things where I was hearing that QAnon was full of anti-Semitic tropes, but no one ever told us what the tropes were. And you very quickly see the connection to blood libel, the connection to the fact that, you know, Jews were a threat to Christian children. And you see this repurposing of the Jews as not just being a threat, but also the puppet masters controlling things, either through, let's say, the Rothschild family or George Soros or Janet Yellen. So the idea was very resonant to all the things that I had studied in high school. And so it was very funny that my high school friends were like, I recognize the lecture. So it was the one section that I just started writing from memory about how we had these blood libels, and the blood libels travel all over the world. We even saw them in 1860 in Syria. So it wasn't something exclusively in Europe. Mm-hmm. But we also saw the connection to blood libels and the Catholic Church and pogroms in Russia. And so what was so interesting for me is, first of all, you had the protocols being a fictional, basically a fraudulent narrative that the Russian secret police created. And what was so interesting was, at the outset, Russia was amplifying QAnon conspiracy material so that they were retweeting it or using bots. And so here you had, like, it came full circle. The protocols start with Russia, and then QAnon is aided by Russia. But I also recognize things that went deeper than just the protocols to sort of the historic anti-Semitism in the church. What was so interesting about QAnon is it's also anti-Catholic. So it's a little bit different from historic anti-Semitism, that it's not embedded within Catholicism, where you would see upticks in anti-Semitic attacks, let's say during Easter. But it also attacks Catholics. It also attacks lots of different groups that, you know, I guess the joke would have been, you know, same groups that Hitler would have targeted. So QAnon, in addition to being anti-Semitic, it's also LGBTQ+, it's also anti-African-American, anti-people of color. There's so much going on there. And so that's where we wanted to unpack it. And it's not just about Jews, but it's about all the groups that the conspiracy theory perceives as threatening in some way.
So, Sophia, talk to us a little bit about how widespread it is for people to believe in parts or all of QAnon, and what is it about QAnon that your research has shown draws people into it and causes them not only to believe in it, but to kind of fall into an obsession with it, really, or a fixation with it?
So there were a number of national polls that sampled representative groups of Americans and Canadians, and they all agree that roughly about 15% of the American adult population believe to some version of QAnon conspiracy arrangement. So, you know, they believe in the cabal of blood-drinking pedophiles that control the media and the government. They believe in QAnon being perpetrated by design, you know, by some evil entity like maybe Bill Gates or George Soros or this world government. And so 15% of the American population of adults is over 30 million people just in the US alone. It's an enormous number of people who, you know, if we're to believe these, and, you know, it's a different entity every time they sample, but they come up with about the same number. So I tend to believe that number. So how is it possible that this huge proportion of the population fell for this baseless conspiracy theory? There's several explanations, and one of them Mia already kind of touched upon. So when we look at the rate of engagement of people online with QAnon content, from the first Q drops, which happened in October of 2017, we see a very slight increase in the number of people who engage with this content over time, like a little bit more, but barely visible slope of that line. But then COVID happens and state-imposed lockdowns. And we see a geometric progression in the number of people who became interested in this content, who spread it by sharing it, liking it, and so on. And we see it across different platforms. It's on Telegram and YouTube and Instagram and Facebook. It's all over the place. And so there are several characteristics of that time that we've all experienced, we can relate to it, that likely contributed to this. One of them, as Mia mentioned, is this feeling of uncertainty. And lack of control over what was happening. We didn't know what our lives were going to look like in a year, in 5 years. We had little control over this virus that we knew very little about. We felt anxious, and we felt lonely and isolated because, of course, lockdowns put us, you know, inside of our homes with little chance of interacting with others. And we know from psychology research that all of those four conditions, uncertainty, lack of control, anxiety, and loneliness or isolation, they all independently make anybody more likely to engage with, entertain, and actually believe conspiracy theories. So people like you or me or Mia, if they're put under those conditions in an experimenter's lab, they are more likely to believe conspiracy theories. But there was also something going on for those people who actually did end up in QAnon, unlike you or Mia or myself. And that has to do with the particular characteristics of this population, we believe, which is largely white, middle-class population that feels aggrieved at the government for, you know, living a life that they never thought was going to be their future when they were growing up. When they were growing up, they were envisioning, you know, something like a Little House on the Prairie, with the father going to work and the mom staying home in her little apron and, you know, whipping up dinners for a large family, and, you know, Black and brown people outside somewhere making this possible without mentioning them. But as we know, life has changed, and a single earner household is not possible for most people. And women were, you know, made to consider careers that a lot of them were interested in. And when they entered the workplace, the pay was not the same as it was for men. And they were still carrying burdens of household work and childcare, even as they were taking on these additional duties at work. And the entrance onto the social scene and the work scene of minorities that can be blamed for all of this unpleasantness that people were experiencing, this disconnect from what they thought for themselves was the future and what ended up being their lives, that only made it that much worse. They saw the government as betraying them in a number of different ways, you know, sex scandals in Washington, D.C. and in Hollywood, corruption scandals, eroded this trust in the government. They saw science as being malevolent because of, you know, all the pesticides in the food and the opioid drug crisis and the health insurance costs being exorbitant while health care being less and less helpful. And so this group of people were particularly aggrieved and feeling upset at the world. And during lockdowns, they went online because that's where we all went. And through these algorithms on Facebook and on Twitter, very quickly, they went from benign, quests about like Donald Trump as a presidential candidate or COVID as the new, health crisis, to QAnon content, which spoke to them because it explained all of this injustice that they perceived, and it gave them a promise of how things were going to get back to normal. It told them whom to blame for all of this trouble, and of course, Jews are always a convenient target. It's a classical trope of a scapegoat. So George Soros became this meme. It's a veiled way of expressing your belief that Jews are behind everything that's bad in the world. And so to these people, QAnon was an outlet to a lot of their frustrations, a lot of their strong feelings of, outrage and anger and just being untrusting of anything that the mass media and the government puts forth. And QAnon became their go-to alternative.
So let's talk a little bit about who is Q, the Q of QAnon. And because I think it's important to understand that people are not just randomly, yes, they're getting QAnon content through algorithms on social media, but it's also that there were people who deliberately put QAnon content on the internet and got it all started. And there's obviously a dispute or an uncertainty about who the person, so Q in QAnon is supposedly the person who was putting these Q drops on the internet that started early in the Trump administration and supposedly purported to predict that Hillary Clinton was going to be arrested and a whole bunch of things were going to happen. And it started because people fell into the rabbit hole, as it were, because they were chasing these Q drops and trying to make sense of his or her or their prophecy. But I've always wondered that it seemed to me that whoever was putting these Q drops on the internet seemed to know exactly the things that you're talking about with his or her intended audience. And it seemed like it was an effort to, the person knew what the reaction could be or would be. And I'm wondering, Mia, if you can talk a little bit about what we do and don't know about who Q might be, person or persons working together, and some of the research that has gone on to try to determine who started this all.
So we have a chapter in the book where we're like, okay, let's figure out who Q is. And part of this was, sort of the Cliff's Notes. There are 6 hours of an HBO documentary and 6 hours of a Vice News documentary, and we basically distilled it. And what we came up with was it's very likely that whoever was posting as Q is different people at different times. And we likened it to, which is one of my favorite movies, The Princess Bride, the Dread Pirate Roberts. Remember, there's this whole speech where Buttercup says, but Wesley, you've only been gone 2 years, and the Dread Pirate Roberts has been around for such a long time. And it's the name that mattered. And so we think that whoever was Q changed from person to person. Now, if you watch the HBO documentary, they basically, Cullen Hallbeck comes down to this idea that it was Ron Watkins, who, interestingly enough, just registered to run for office in Arizona. But Ron Watkins, or Jim Watkins' dad, these were people who were in charge of 8chan, and again, a history, a somewhat checkered history of hosting pornography and anti-Semitism and really horrible stuff, because these chans were really kind of the sewers of the internet. And so what happens is, over time, in part because of the way that people became attracted to QAnon, and also you had individuals who were taking QAnon and walking you through, how do you trace the Q drop? How do you figure out what it's saying? People like Tracy Diaz, or Tracy Beans, as she's known by, or you had people who were creating very clean platforms on the internet with like pull down menus and icons, like something that your grandmother could use. Because on 4chan and 8chan or 8kun, you really needed to be a little bit more tech savvy. And so once it went to Facebook, once it went to Instagram, now you're widening the berth of people who believe in QAnon. So basically,
can I just stop you right there? Can we back that up a little bit, just to let's unpack that a little bit, right? Can you tell us a little bit more about what 4chan, 8chan, 8kun are? I mean, these are really extremist message boards that would make most people's hair stand up on end, right? And so they have a small, not small, I guess a limited kind of audience, not your suburban mom who might find QAnon on Facebook, right? I mean, so like there's a difference between those kinds of sites and Facebook or Instagram or TikTok.
Absolutely. And so what happened was it starts on 4chan. And as Sophia mentioned, you have these Q drops, and the first Q drop in October 2017 predicted, Hillary Clinton is about to get arrested. And of course, none of the predictions came true. The predictions said that Trump would be reelected in 2020, that both Barack Obama would be hanged and Hillary Clinton would be arrested, that Michelle Obama is not a woman. It had crazy stuff on there. Now, these message boards are really the underbelly of the internet. It moved from 4chan to 8chan. When it moved to 8chan, that's possibly where we see a change of hands, where the Watkins who were in charge of 8chan could control all of the codes associated with QAnon. And so it's very techy. But then there was this idea to move it from the chans to the subreddits, to Reddit and the subreddits. And so there was a subreddit dedicated, calm before the storm. There were a number of subreddits. Now on the subreddits, the way that worked is that was a little bit more accessible. When it went from these very techy parts of the internet to things like Facebook, that's when your grandmother started following it. Mm-hmm. And what we noticed was that during the pandemic, we started to see what we ordinarily assume to be more left-wing types, people who are vegans, people who practice yoga, people who were into homeopathic remedies or breastfeeding. In other words, it started appearing on Instagram in the feeds of people who were ordinarily associated with, more earthy, crunchy, lefty causes. And so we saw this connection between QAnon and anti-vaccine and COVID-19 as a hoax start to come together. And by coming together, that's where it started to bring in lots of different kinds of people. And I know that, we associate QAnon very much with Republicans. But of course, the 6% of the people who believe in QAnon identify as Democrats, and many of them were people who'd supported Bernie Sanders. And I think that when it moves from these darkest recesses of the internet to, these message boards to then Facebook or Instagram, then it starts having a wide-ranging appeal. Now, the reason it moved from 8chan to 8kun is that these message boards came under a lot of pressure as a result of what happened in Christchurch. Remember, many of these message boards were not only hosting the statements of terrorists and mass casualty shooters, but they would even show the videos, the live stream videos of these terrorist attacks. And so that's what led to what we now call the Christchurch Accord. And that's what led to social media kind of clamping down. And when social media clamped down, first Reddit outlawed QAnon in 2018. By 2020, you started seeing Facebook and Instagram and even Etsy no longer allowing many QAnon accounts.
So, Sophia, let's talk a little bit about Trump being at the center of QAnon as the hero or the savior, or really like a messianic figure in QAnon's philosophy, and how that plays a role in sort of a perception of the QAnon believer of there being, the good guy who's under attack, by these evil forces, George Soros, the baby eating, sex abusing cabal, and that he's under threat by them in their view, right? But he's yet going to rise as the heroic figure in the end and vanquish them. And so what is it? What do we know about the psychology or sociology of like believing in that in a setting like QAnon for people?
I think our best chance of really understanding it is to see QAnon as what it really is. It's a grassroots movement that spends a lot of their free time designing folklore, designing these narratives around, these Q drops that are the dots that they're supposed to connect. And so if you think about, before QAnon, not where QAnon came from, but where Donald Trump came from, and you look at the trends in the data that we have about hate speech and hate crime and anti-Semitic crime, you see that those began to rise a lot just before the 2016 presidential election. There was a many-fold increase in the number of anti-Semitic crimes between 2014 and 2016, and it continued to climb. And so people who came to vote for Trump were already existing in this environment of increasing hatred and anti-Semitism and this aggressive grievance. And so Donald Trump, for them in 2016, was this idea of somebody who is anti-establishment. He was presumably, not a Washington insider, so he was not part of the system that they saw as corrupt and irrevocably broken. And his behavior, even at debates and at his public appearances, was defying every social norm. And in that way, it spoke to people who felt that all of our social norms are way off. We're not looking at the right people for whom to blame. We're not looking at the right people for who would save us out of this. And so Donald Trump, this international figurehead, a guy who came on this narrative of, making his own fortune, which is ridiculous, as a lot of QAnon folklore is, but this is another piece. He provided this projection screen onto which a lot of people could, throw all of their emotions and expectations and hopes and dreams. And he embraced that role for himself. He expressed, explicitly, that they like me and it's kind of cool. He retweeted some of their content. He was
still on Twitter, right?
Yes. He was very close with some of the people who were promoting this content, like General Flynn. So it's not that he necessarily was the driving force behind it, but in his usual roundabout way, he was helpful in spreading it. And so he basically allowed this unfounded hope of these people to flourish and take on this wild form that it became with QAnon.
And I want you to also talk a little bit about people who get sucked into it, right? Who might be feeling like they have a mission to perform. So there is this messianic figure in Trump, but each individual person who gets sucked into QAnon also sees themselves as having a mission primarily to save the children, right? And so how much does the idea that you can be a hero too, right? Like, yes, Trump ultimately is going to be the savior of everything, but in the meantime, you can perform your own heroic role to save the children. How important is that in people? You talked a little bit about people needing a sense of grounding in an uncertain world, but how much does giving you this sense of purpose or meaning in your life play for people?
So I'll start and then I'll give it over to Mia with concrete examples. But QAnon provided a lot of psychological services to people who followed it. It provided a social connection at a time when a lot of people really needed it. It provided a sense of a little bit of control and certainty in a very uncertain time where people lacked control. And one really important thing that it provided was a sense of meaning in life. And we don't really talk a lot about it because it's kind of ethereal. It's hard to quantify it, but it's extremely important for psychological well-being. And a lot of people, find themselves lacking it because, in the process of pursuing the more quantifiable goals, like, making good living and, building a home and a family, this deeper meaning just slips by them. And so QAnon entered the scene with the promise of saving the children, this idea of innocence, and violated children, the ultimate victims. And so you got to feel like you are being the ultimate hero by tracing these clues to the root of the problem and helping to identify the perpetrators who are abusing these children. And so, yes, Save the Children became this rallying cry, especially among a particular demographic. So, these Instagram moms who were already worried about, vaccines and worried about content that their children were exposed to at school and so on. And I'll let Mia take over from there.
Well, and it's interesting because Sophia and I have been studying terrorism for many, many decades. Between the two of us, I think we have like 50 years of terrorism research under our belt. And one of the things that struck me is I had just finished a book on women in ISIS. And the way that ISIS recruited young women, in the United States or in Britain was, did you want to help the children? Did you want to save the orphans in Syria? And who's going to say no to that? And so it was so fascinating to see QAnon using some of the same tricks of the trade. Did you want to save the children? No one's ever going to say, I don't care about the children. But what was so fascinating was which children they were talking about. They were talking about not the children who are actually trafficked, not the Save the Children children you see in the charity in New York and in London, not children of color, but white children. And what was so interesting, and I would love to share just this image to show you, if I have the ability just to give you a snippet into this insight, is that when you look at the way that they are portraying it, now you see here, what they're doing is, it's generally a white child and very often a black or brown hand over the child's mouth. Now on the right-hand side, this was a study we did of Save the Children, where we looked at images. Now, in the QAnon series of images that were hashtag Save the Children, and they were very hard to find because Facebook refused to release them, so we had to find them in other places. We saw 94% of the children were white. We then looked at the charity. When you look at Save the Children charity, 98% of the children are not white. But then when I was looking at QAnon and anti-Semitism, I saw the same images of a child who is terrified with a hand over her mouth that she can't scream, but again, emblazoned with, some symbolism that it's Jews that are doing it. So first it was people of color, then it became Jewish people. So what we're seeing is QAnon is using so many of these existing tropes. I had went back into 1905 to read The Klansman, this idea of Gus, the African-American slave who's coming after your white women. And then also remember on the escalator, as Donald Trump went down the escalator to announce that he was running for president, he was talking about, these people are rapists. Maybe there's a few good ones. So this idea of looking at the other, the brown other, or the Jewish other as being a sexual direct threat to white children became embedded as part of QAnon. The other thing that's really strange and disturbing, and I was answering one of the questions in the chat, is in the summer, we detected 5 QAnon channels in Hebrew. So we went through the Hebrew QAnon channels to do an analysis. And recently we've seen that those 5 now are 15 channels. So it's almost counterintuitive that you would think that Jewish people would believe in QAnon, given how much of it is anti-Semitic, and yet they are still able to pull people down the rabbit hole. And they're using certain Orthodox rabbis, or they're using things that, you know, again, were controversies in Israel. For example, the way the Mizrahim Jews were treated in the 1950s. So that children went missing, or that children were born and they were fine and all of a sudden they were dead. And the rumor was that those children were being gifted to Ashkenazi families. And so QAnon has used, in Hebrew, has used many of these, like the most basic, terrifying rumors that have existed politically in Israel. We also see QAnon in other countries. And in each country, it takes on a slightly different flavor. So in France, it's connected to the Yellow Jackets, Gilets jaunes. And in Germany, it's connected to the right wing and neo-Nazis. And in like all over the world, it takes on a slightly different flavor. And so it blends in with its local environment. And one of the reasons why QAnon is so unique is it is the most adaptive conspiracy theory we've ever seen.
So let's stay on that theme of it being adaptive, right? Because one of the central features of the way it functions is that followers are encouraged to do their own research. And so there are hints and clues and prophecies that are provided to them, but, you know, we haven't heard from Q in a long time, many, many months. And people are still, quote unquote, doing their own research. So how does that play a role in keeping people engaged in it, even as Q has virtually disappeared off the internet, Q, the supposed person?
I think it's an interesting feature of QAnon that it doesn't really have a leadership. It's a real grassroots movement. In some instances, that's a weakness. So after January 6th, when the prophecy of Donald Trump coming back triumphantly and executing members of the cabal in front of the White House didn't come true, a lot of QAnon followers felt lost, and they would have loved for some authority figure to come out and explain what's going on and tell them, you know, how to feel and what to do next. And nobody was doing that. So a part of QAnon following was probably lost to them as a result of no leadership. But on the other hand, it's also a strength, because a leadership is, by definition, you know, it's both the person when you need it and the person when you don't need it. So any one person has something that can be argued against or brought down on the basis of being a weakness, but QAnon is not vulnerable for its leadership, and it can pivot in whatever direction is most fruitful to them without anybody at the top steering them in a particular direction. So after January 6th, you know, we saw a part of QAnon kind of drift away. But then the rest of QAnon developed a new narrative around the failed prophecy that alternatively said that, you know, actually Biden was not sworn in as a president, because in fact, it wasn't a Bible that he held his hand on. It was some other book that was made to look like a Bible. Or alternatively that, this was a pre-taped ceremony, but in fact, just for the rubes, but in fact, Donald Trump is fully, you know, president, and we just can't know because there's important things happening. Or that Biden is a bodysuit that Trump wears while he's, you know, running as president. And whatever your level of, depth into the rabbit hole, that's the kind of explanation that you are able to embrace then, without, you know, anything rubbing you the wrong way from something that leadership said. So it's an interesting feature. It's interesting to me also what's going to happen long term to QAnon, because we've seen concerted efforts from right-wing militia groups in the United States to sweep up all those QAnon followers who became confused, felt disenfranchised, lied to as a result of the failed prophecy. They really swooped in, and we saw directives from the leadership of right-wing militia groups to embrace them, bring them in, explain to them our agenda while they're feeling this, loss and confusion. And so, there are many possibilities. One is that QAnon will fracture into some more radical movements and some, more like folklorish movements that are just creating narratives online, and that's what they do. And it's possible that it will just pivot the whole thing into a new direction along the same lines that it's doing right now. So the lack of leadership is interesting, and it's both useful and sometimes harmful to them.
I mean,
Thea, did you have something to add to that?
Sorry, there was one other thing to consider. When people thought they were doing their own research, these Q drops were preceded. They knew exactly what conclusion that you would come to. So instead of, someone saying, well, this is what I read. No, I figured it out myself. But also people are so proud of themselves and they start to feel like, it's because I'm really clever. And not only are they feeling good about themselves that they figured out something that no one else realizes, it almost instigates like a proselytizing desire. Now you have to tell everybody, so you're at the Christmas table or the Hanukkah table and you're convincing your second and third cousin, no, they're drinking blood. And so what they were doing was they were tracing these Q drops, or you had someone like Jason Galinas, who was a Citibank executive who created the Q map, which was, again, a very user-friendly platform compared to the 4chan, 8chan, where the drops originally were posted. But also you had people that started to feel like, I have to tell everybody what I know. It's my personal responsibility. And so part of it is, Sophia, being a clinical psychologist, can explain to you that arguing with like members of your family or people you work with or someone that believes in this is counterproductive. And we used to joke, we probably if these representative samples that were done by American Enterprises Institute, the poll, or by the Institute for the Study of Religion, if these polls are representative of the US population, we could be looking at as many as 30 million Americans that believe in the most extreme premise that there's a blood drinking cabal that is controlling the Democrats and that, they are drinking the blood of children and sexually abusing the children. Now, what was interesting is we used to joke with someone probably in your family or someone and then I found out that my cousin actually believes in QAnon, and I thought, including in my own family. So basically, Sophia wanted to, in the book, do something that ordinarily academics never do. We wanted to give you step-by-step instructions. How can you help? Because, it takes a village. It's going to take all of us to help get people out of this conspiracy and back into the light.
So I'm going to ask Sophia to briefly describe what people should do if someone in their family or their life has fallen into QAnon. And then I'm going to go to some of the audience questions.
So as Mia already said, one thing not to do is to try to argue or logic people out of their opinions. That's going to backfire. Research shows that if you do that, and even if you win that argument, a week later, a month later, your counterpart will come back to their original belief stronger than they were before. They didn't come to that belief out of logic. And so even if you take the logic away from them, they're still going to be, wanting to indulge in those emotions that brought them to the belief. So one thing that I think is important to consider, even though I understand that it's not possible for everyone who has a loved one in QAnon, is that one of the major appeals of QAnon is social connection. And so although the impulse is often to just cut all communication and all ties, because this person drives you mad, maybe, like it's impossible, right, to have a reasonable conversation with them about current events. If you can stay in their lives, that is a far more productive choice in the long term, because we know from our research on radicalization that people don't just go in one direction when they develop a radical idea. They go back and forth, they waver, they doubt. And if you, put them into the corner where the only people around them are others with radical idea, the chance that they will ever come out of that corner are diminishingly small. But if you leave a door for them to walk through, because you have a relationship with them, that makes it a lot more possible that in the moment when they are, doubtful, they will come to you. And then one really helpful phrase that research found for communicating with people who are in QAnon in your life is simply to say, I understand how you feel. Just that. That we know, again, from research, that this makes people a lot less defensive and a lot more open to entertaining ideas that are counter to their own belief. And then just, let them talk. You don't need to engage with them on cognitive level. You don't need to, prove your point. Just being there and connecting with them on this emotional level does a good deal of work toward bringing them out of their radicalized mindset. There's some other suggestions in the book, and some of them are like, it may seem a little cookie, but they work. So exposure to nature reduces political polarization. So if it's someone in your immediate family, taking a walk in the park or in the woods is likely to leave them more open cognitively to ideas that are counter to their own. So yeah, we have a lot of really interesting suggestions, and it's a difficult situation. So while you're considering what to do for those people, it's equally as important to consider your own peace of mind. It's like on the airplane, they say you need to put the mask on yourself first, because having someone in your life who's a QAnon believer is very stressful and very challenging. And we can't be helpful to anybody if we ourselves are not in a good place mentally, emotionally. And so I think remembering that and addressing our own mental health is also very, very important.
So I'm going to try to consolidate some of the sort of similar questions that the audience has. One of the questions from one of the audience members was how very observant Jews can believe in QAnon. This audience member said that they had a family member who believed in QAnon. And somebody else asked, how do QAnoners perceive Trump's Jewish daughter and son-in-law and grandchildren?
What's interesting
Jared and Ivanka, obviously.
Well, so Ivanka and Jared, yeah. So what's interesting is that depending which QAnon influencer you're following, some are more anti-Semitic than others. And so there's QAnon John, who's extremely anti-Semitic.
Just back up for a little. QAnon influencers are people who have like a social media presence on YouTube, although I think YouTube has banned QAnon content.
YouTube has banned them, yes.
Yeah, but they have some kind of presence on the internet that gives them this status of influencer, but they're basically self-made sorts of, entrance into this market, so to speak.
Because the social media companies, starting in July of 2020, and then again in October 2020, right before the election, deplatformed a lot of the QAnon accounts, and it prevented QAnon from raising money. And so what happens is, like ISIS, when ISIS was deplatformed from Facebook and Twitter, where did they go? They went to the Russian platform called Telegram. And so we anticipated that once QAnon was being kicked off of the sort of Silicon Valley internet, we were on Telegram waiting for them. Now, what you have is you have hundreds of different kinds of QAnon accounts. Some of the accounts are going to be like Marjorie Taylor Greene, but some of them are very like anti-Semitic, and that's their whole raison d'etre. And so they talk about Trump as being the savior, but they never talk about Ivanka or Jared. Whereas some of the other ones are a little bit less anti-Semitic. And so part of this is this notion that, well, Trump can't possibly, be anti-Semitic because he has anti-Semitic family members. is not necessarily borne out by some of the statements.
It is Jewish family members. Yeah.
It is Jewish or Jewish convert family members. And it's not borne out when Trump would make jokes about Jewish bankers. But we do see QAnon sort of reinforcing that the media is controlled by Jews, that COVID-19 was caused by Jews, and that they will take sort of some of these old tropes that we've seen. Hollywood is controlled because QAnon sees Hollywood as pedowood. There is a connection between Hollywood and child trafficking and Jeffrey Epstein and sort of the cabal. So this is where some of the subtle and not so subtle anti-Semitism comes in. But I'll be honest with you, we try to understand why Orthodox Jews would even be attracted to QAnon. And according to the Institute for the Study of Religion, Jews are the smallest religious group that believes in QAnon, but of the Jews that believe in it, it's generally Orthodox Jews, in part because they love Trump, because they voted disproportionately for Trump, but also because there's elements of QAnon that appeals to the Orthodox community. For example, vaccine refusal. So once QAnon is anti-vax, it resonates with particular groups within the Orthodox community. But the Hebrew language QAnon channels were a little bit less overtly anti-Semitic. There was still anti-Semitism, but it wasn't nearly as bad as what we were seeing on the regular QAnon in English channels.
So another audience member asked about a CNN documentary on conspiracy theories, which I haven't seen. And she says that she has active QAnon groups where she lives in Florida. And I think she's just trying to make sense out of various things she's read about or seen on CNN, how QAnon talks about Janet Yellen. And she also refers to an interview with the journalist Ann Applebaum. Mia, you said you wanted to address this question, so go ahead.
Well, so interesting that it's Florida. When we look at the summer 2020 primaries, there were 97 QAnon candidates. Of those 97, only 24 went forward to the November 2020 election. The three states that had the most QAnon candidates, Florida, California, and Texas. And next, following up, would have been Arizona. And so it should come as no surprise that the person in the audience was talking about Florida, because we see a lot of QAnon candidates in Florida. Now, let me go forward to the Lisa link. I think, if I didn't see it, but if I'm not mistaken, I saw from the clip that she interviewed Melissa, Rain Lively, who is one of these QAnon defectors. So there've been a number of these women who have left and have talked about their experiences, and they've done us a really great service of giving us this insider view. And, she was also involved with QAnon for a long time. You had other people like Linka Perrone. So a lot of the people who have left are actually women, which is part of Pastels and Pedophiles. But I think that, we can.
Someone else asked about that in the audience
question. That in.
Can you talk about what the pastels in your title refers to?
So we originally were thinking to talk about women's role in QAnon because many of the people who left were women. And we saw this as being a particularly female inspired movement, although it's 50-50 between men and women. But when it went to Instagram, that's when it went viral. It was women politicians that were the ones who were elected in Colorado and in Georgia. So it had a particular female flavor. And Adrienne LaFrance in the Atlantic article referred to the women in QAnon as pastel QAnon. And this is where the pastels comes from, but this is where also, and this is something that Sophia has also noticed, we talk to a lot of people who are former terrorists. They've left Al-Qaeda, they left neo-Nazis, and they can talk about sort of their own experiences. And maybe we can abstract a little bit from it, but it's limited because we are basically then reifying everyone's experiences being the same. And I think different people reacted to QAnon differently. And we have to allow for, maybe Melissa Rain Lively, that's her experience, but that might have not been the same experience as a grandmother or as an Orthodox Jew or as an evangelical had coming to QAnon.
So what is there, I realize that the defectors have a lot of different life experiences and reasons why they might have defected, but is there any takeaway? This is also an audience question who, somebody asked to tell us more about what you've learned from the defectors. Is there a main takeaway, Sophia, from the defectors that could be, applied across the board to why people decide to leave?
Well, so we don't know how many defectors are there, and the few that were very vocal are few, right? And so they left for a number of different reasons. So one person figured out that these Q drops that were supposed to look like they were foretelling the future were actually picking up on something that usually happens anyway, kind of like when you go to a fortune teller and they tell you, oh, you must have suffered a terrible breakup in the past, because most people have suffered a terrible breakup in the past, So it was an artificial correlation that was meant to make people go like, oh my goodness, they knew, in the way we go with, with predictions of a fortune teller. Somebody else, like their whole life fell apart. Like Lenka Perron was doing so much research online day and night. At one point she was neglecting her own kids, like saving the mythical children online. She was neglecting her own 3 children who were like eating takeout and left to their own devices. Some people lost their jobs because of this, and like lost their businesses. People who had, let's say, a beauty salon and then became notorious for some rant that got taped and then posted online. They lost all of their clientele. This woman who had a very public meltdown in Target, destroying a mask display, ended up, like, her husband ended up calling the police and asking them to put her into a mental health involuntary confinement because she just unraveled. And in retrospect, she believes that that was the right thing to do, because she was really, her mental health was just decompensating all over the place through her QAnon involvement. So there are different ways that these defectors paint out of QAnon. Most of them are quite dramatic, because if you think about the selection of people who end up speaking to the press, they have to tell a story that's dramatic, right?
Right.
For all we know, there's a whole other population who just quietly had a reckoning that stemmed from their own reflection, their own kind of taking in of all this information and figuring out that it doesn't actually make sense. But these people are not really accessible to us. It's hard to do research on QAnon because these people are so mistrustful of science. They don't want to answer questions. They're paranoid a little bit. And a lot of them are embarrassed, especially people who, have left QAnon. They don't want to relive this experience that cost them so much of their identity and sometimes their social life and their professional life.
Or their family in some cases.
And their families, for sure. And so, but we're making inroads, we're collecting data, we're reaching people, and you have to understand, this is a very new problem. As psychological problems go, Mia and I have been doing research on terrorism for decades, and we can tell a number of interesting findings, but QAnon really only came to our attention a couple of years ago. So it's a work in progress understanding them, and they're rapidly changing even as we're making that happen.
Well, it looks like we are out of time, but I want to thank both of you for all of your work and for sharing it with us today. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of the audience questions because there were a lot of them, and we unfortunately had limited time, but I also wanted to thank the audience for all of your thoughtful questions as well.
Yes, and I want to thank you, Sarah, Sophia, Mia. Thank you all for this fascinating, eye-opening, informative conversation. We really appreciate it, and I really appreciate you all answering questions in the Q&A as well. I wanted to remind everybody that today's session is recorded and will be on our website tomorrow morning, momentmag.com/Zoominars. We'll also be sending a follow-up email later this week, and we'll have links to both Sophia and Mia and then Sarah's book. I've also put the links to the books in the chat so you can purchase all of that. Again, thank you, everybody. I wanted to remind folks you can register for next week's Zoominar, which is on the critical years at the end of the 20th century. Thank you again, and we will see everybody next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming.